I woke up before the alarm, like my body still believed in a schedule. The room was dark and cold in that thin way it gets right before morning, when the air feels clean, but you can tell it's been sitting still all night. I lay there listening for the sounds that used to cue my day. Nothing came. Just the fridge hum and the tick of a cheap wall clock. Then it hit me, the same way it had hit me every morning for weeks. There was no shift, no shop, no time card. I'd been out almost a month, and the only reason I kept waking up like this was habit, the kind you don't shake just because someone tells you to stand by. My stomach felt hollow, not hunger exactly, more like the space where routine used to sit. The shop didn't shut down clean. One day it was normal. The next, there were people in fresh uniforms walking the bay with clipboards, asking for logs that weren't where they were supposed to be. There'd been a serious accident, the kind that turns everybody quiet and makes you stare at the floor while the boss talks too fast. After that, word spread that management might have been signing off inspections they didn't actually do, faking maintenance paperwork so nobody had to answer for skipped safety steps. They called it an investigation. I called it a padlock on the gate and a line of guys like me holding our lunches with nowhere to go. I chased work after that, anything that kept me moving. A half day here, a late night call there, cash jobs that ended the second the problem did. Nothing steady, nothing that covered rent. Rent was late. I'd tried not to open the emails, but my phone kept lighting up with polite reminders that didn't feel polite anymore once you read them twice. Groceries were down to eggs, rice, and the end of a jar of peanut butter. My bank app was a number I checked like it might bite me. I kept my tool bag by the door anyway. It was the only thing in my apartment that still felt like proof. Solid weight, familiar handles, the smell of oil and old work gloves. I thought about going back to my parents' place, then pushed it away. They'd make room. They'd worry. I couldn't stand hearing my mom go quiet when she tried not to sound disappointed, or my dad pretending it was no big deal. I told myself I just needed one real job, one check that didn't bounce, 1 week where my phone didn't feel like a threat. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I let it ring, then ring again, and when it buzzed a third time, I saw the name. "You still looking?" Dale Mercer asked. "Yeah," I said. "I got something. It's night work, but it's real money," he told me. I sat up, elbows on my knees, staring at my tool bag by the door like it could hear him too. The numbers were already running in my head: rent, utilities, food, the days I had left before reminders turned into something else. I didn't answer right away. I just listened, because listening was cheaper than pretending I didn't need it, and my hands were already sweating like they knew. Dale didn't waste time easing into it. That was his thing. Even back at the shop, he talked like the world was on a timer and you were either keeping up or getting left. "It's a facilities night runner spot in Nevada, federal contract," Dale Mercer said. The words landed heavy. Nevada was far enough that it wasn't a casual change. Federal contract meant paperwork, rules, somebody else's definition of normal. My first instinct was to say no, just to feel like I had a choice. But the second instinct was the one that mattered. Money. "What kind of site?" I asked. "Restricted. Don't overthink it," he told me. Restricted could mean a lot of things: military, research, anything with fences and cameras and people who didn't like questions. Dale wasn't the kind of guy to hype a story, but he also wasn't the kind of guy to dig into details if the check cleared. He told me what he knew, which wasn't much. A contractor had called around looking for someone with facilities experience who could handle nights and didn't need their hand held. Dale had given my name because he knew I wasn't afraid of dirty work and I could keep my mouth shut when it mattered. He said the pay was real, the kind of pay that made your stomach unclench just thinking about it. He texted me a number while we were still on the phone. An HR contact, Kara Lyle. I stared at the name on my screen after we hung up, thumb hovering over the call button like it might burn me. My apartment felt smaller in the daylight. The air had warmed up a little, but the place still smelled like stale coffee and laundry detergent. I could hear my neighbor's shower through the wall, the normal sound of somebody else's life continuing. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. Kara picked up on the second ring. Her voice was steady, not friendly, not rude, just clean. Like she'd said the same sentences all day and they were still sharp at the edges. "This role is need to know. Can you work a checklist without freelancing?" Kara Lyle asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said. That was the tone of the whole call. Direct questions, direct answers. No small talk, no tell me about yourself, no fake laughter. She asked what I'd worked on, what my comfort level was with HVAC maintenance, whether I'd done panel inspections, whether I knew what a normal generator sound was under load, and what it sounded like when something was starting to go wrong. She asked how I logged work. Paper, digital, both. She asked if I'd ever been written up for skipping steps. I told her the truth. I wasn't perfect, but I wasn't sloppy. I'd spent enough nights crawling into mechanical rooms that smelled like hot dust and old insulation to know you don't survive by guessing. You survive by checking what you can check, writing it down, and not lying to yourself because you're tired. Every time I tried to ask a follow-up, she slid past it like it wasn't relevant. Location? Nevada? Start date? Soon? Shift? Nights? Who do I report to? Site foreman. What's the facility? Restricted site. What kind of restricted site? Need to know. She didn't sound mysterious. She sounded like policy. Then she brought up the background check, not in a threatening way, in a matter-of-fact way, like she was telling me I'd need steel-toe boots. She said there would be paperwork, a review of my work history, and that if I had any unreported incidents, it would come up and it would end the process. I swallowed hard at that because incident meant different things to different people. To me, it meant the day the shop got quiet after the accident, the day everyone pretended the paperwork had always been clean. To Kara, it probably meant arrests and lawsuits and things with file numbers. When the call ended, I sat there with the phone still in my hand, staring at my cracked kitchen counter. My pulse was up like I'd just climbed a ladder too fast. It wasn't excitement. It was that feeling you get when you realize you've stepped onto something that doesn't care if you're ready. She emailed me within 10 minutes. No logo splashed across the top. No friendly message. Just a list of next steps and an address for a call-in the next day. There was a line that said, Groom Lake area, like it was just another zip code. I shouldn't have searched it. That's the kind of thing I normally avoid, because once your brain has an image, it won't stop using it. But I searched it anyway, because if I was going to cross half the country for a job, I wanted to know what I was walking into. Groom Lake. At first, it was nothing but desert on the map, pale tan and empty, the kind of empty that makes you realize how small towns are when you zoom out. Then, the suggestions and headlines started filling in the gaps for me. Area 51. The name everyone knows, whether they want to or not. For a second, I felt stupid, like I'd been offered a job inside a campfire story. The rumors came back on instinct, the ones you hear from people who swear they heard it from someone who worked out there. UFOs, disappearances, weird lights, men in unmarked vehicles. It all rose up the way it always does when you say the name. Then I shut it down, hard like closing a breaker. Every government site has stories. Every fenced place people can't enter collects myths like dust. People fill in blank spaces with whatever scares them. And I wasn't signing up to chase secrets. I wasn't signing up to look behind locked doors. I was signing up to do what I'd always done. Walk the route, check the equipment, write the log, go home. I stood up and opened my fridge like it might have changed while I was on the phone. It hadn't. The empty shelves stared back at me. I looked at the rent reminder on my screen, the date circled in my head. The number that didn't care about my pride or my parents' feelings or what stories people told about a patch of desert in Nevada. I accepted, because I needed the money. That was the honest reason. But there was another reason underneath it, quieter and harder to admit. I wanted to prove to myself I could still be useful, that I wasn't done. When I hit send, it felt like relief and it felt like a mistake, both at the same time, like I'd just fixed one problem by creating a new one I couldn't see yet. The pickup point wasn't marked with a big sign or a friendly front desk. It was just a plain building with too much light in the windows and a parking lot that felt like it had been scrubbed clean. No weeds in the cracks, no loose carts. Even the trash can had a lid that actually closed. The air smelled like hot asphalt and dry wind, and the sky had that hard Nevada blue that makes everything look sharper than it should. I parked where I was told and sat for a second with my hands on the steering wheel, letting my eyes adjust. My tool bag was in the passenger seat, zipped shut, heavy like an anchor. I'd packed light otherwise. Boots, 2 changes of clothes, deodorant, a cheap notebook I'd bought because it felt normal to write things down. My phone buzzed once with a notification I didn't open. The last thing I wanted was to walk inside already thinking about rent. Inside, it turned even more controlled. A counter, a couple of chairs bolted to the floor, and 2 cameras pointed at the same space like they didn't trust each other. A man behind glass checked my name, then slid a clipboard through a slot like he'd done it 1,000 times. I signed forms I didn't get to read all the way through. I handed over the stuff they told me to hand over. Phone, smartwatch, anything with a camera, anything that could record. They put it in a sealed pouch with my name on it like it was evidence. They gave me temporary credentials that didn't feel like credentials. A laminated badge with a color stripe and a barcode. No photo, no last name. Just enough to say I belonged somewhere without saying where. I waited until the inner door buzzed and opened. That's when I met Jonah Prewitt. He wasn't big, but he carried himself like somebody who didn't need to be. Clean uniform, clean boots. A face that didn't give away what he was thinking. He looked at my badge, looked at me, and then turned like the conversation was already over. "Stay with him. Don't wander," Jonah Prewitt said flatly. That was it. No welcome, no joke to break the tension. He walked with a pace that made it clear he expected me to keep up without asking him to slow down. I followed, tool bag in one hand, the other hand empty because it felt safer that way. The hallways were bright and plain, the kind of government beige that makes you feel like you're in a place that's meant to be forgotten. Every door had a keypad or a reader. Every corner had a camera. There were no windows. Time disappeared fast in spaces like that. Jonah didn't point things out. He didn't explain what I was seeing. He just moved me through a sequence of checks and doors like I was a package with routing labels. We passed a room where people sat at terminals, screens glowing in the dim like a row of aquarium tanks. Nobody looked up. We passed a corridor that smelled faintly like metal and cleaning solution, the kind that stings your nose if you breathe too deep. I kept my eyes forward. Facility staging was a smaller room with a battered table, a few metal lockers, and shelves lined with neatly arranged gear. It was the first place I'd been that looked like real work happened there. Scuffed floor, tool marks on the table, a couple of half-empty boxes of gloves, a rack of radios charging in a row. Wade Corbin was already waiting. He was older than me, maybe mid-40s, with that tired strength you see in guys who've done night work long enough that their body stopped fighting it. His shirt was plain. No patches I recognized. He didn't smile, but he didn't look hostile either. He looked like the job itself. He didn't ask how my drive was. He didn't ask if I'd ever been to Nevada before. He opened a locker, pulled out a kit, and laid it on the table like he was laying out evidence. Radio, flashlight. A set of keys that were clipped together with a tag that said, "Limited" in block letters. A clipboard with a printed checklist already labeled for my route. And behind the checklist, clipped tight, a single page that looked like it had been photocopied too many times. Wade tapped the top page with one finger. Not hard, just precise. These aren't suggestions. You break them, you're done, Wade Corbin told me. I looked down at the sheet. 5 rules, short lines, no explanations, no reason why. Just what to do and how to report it, the kind of language you'd use if you didn't want interpretation. Wade watched my eyes track across it, like he was making sure I actually read it instead of pretending. He pointed at the first rule, then at the radio. If you go off route, you say off route, returning. Nothing else, he said. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. The way he said it made the why feel like something that had already happened, something nobody wanted repeated. My throat felt dry. I swallowed and forced my hands to stay steady as I flipped the page once and then flipped it back, like reading it again would make it more normal. Jonah stood in the corner like a door that could talk. He didn't move, but I felt his attention like heat on the side of my face. Wade went over the checklist the way a foreman should. Camera points, check-in cadence, what clean logging meant. Time, status, move on. No freelancing, no side tasks. If something was deferred, it was deferred and reported exactly the right way. He didn't talk about what the facility was. He talked about what the facility needed from me. Then, he slid another clipboard toward me. Signature line. Date. I signed with a pen that felt too light in my fingers. The ink looked dark and permanent, and for a second I thought about my old shop, the way everyone signed whatever got put in front of them because you didn't want to be the guy who slowed down the day. I thought about that accident, about paperwork that said things were safe when they weren't. I signed anyway, because I needed the job, and because saying no at that point would have felt like admitting I was scared of a sheet of paper. Wade clipped the rules behind my checklist again and handed me the kit. The weight of the radio surprised me. Not heavy, but solid. The keys clinked once. The flashlight was colder than it should have been. I tucked the rule sheet behind the clipboard like he'd shown me, but it didn't feel like storing it away. It felt like loading something into my pocket that I might need to survive the night. When Jonah nodded toward the door, I followed. The hallway outside was bright, but the air felt cooler, and the quiet had a different edge to it, now that I knew I was about to be alone on a route I wasn't allowed to improvise. I could feel the rules in my pocket like extra weight, like someone had traded me money for a burden and called it a job. The desert night didn't ease in. It dropped. 1 minute the heat still had its fingers on the concrete, and the next it was gone, like someone opened a door and let all the warmth bleed out into the dark. The air turned dry and sharp enough to sting the back of my throat. When I exhaled, my breath showed for a second, thin and pale, then vanished. Wind pushed across the open space in quick bursts, not a steady breeze, more like the place was breathing through cracked lips. Fine grit skittered along the ground and tapped softly against metal like fingernails. I stood at the start point with my kit settled on my body the way Wade wanted it. Radio clipped, flashlight in my pocket, keys secured on a short tether, clipboard tucked under my arm with the checklist on top and the rules pinned behind it like an afterthought that wasn't an afterthought at all. I did a quick pat-down because I can't help it. It's what you do when you've spent years walking into mechanical rooms and electrical closets, when you've learned that one missing tool becomes an hour of wasted time and a bad decision becomes an incident report. Everything was clean in a way that didn't feel normal. Not clean like organized. Clean like nobody lives here. No dropped screws, no oily footprints, no forgotten coffee cup on a ledge. Even the corners looked like they'd been swept on purpose. The lighting was bright but flat, like a photo taken with a flash. It made surfaces look hard. It made distance hard to judge. It made the shadows too sharp. I keyed my radio because that was the first real step. If I spoke and someone answered, I could pretend this was just another night job with extra fences. Control to Night Runner, confirm your first camera point, Iris Matsu said. Her voice came through crisp and level, like it had been filed down to the words that mattered. No greeting, no filler, just the line. Camera point 1. Copy, I said. I stood where the small sign indicated, under a camera mounted above the doorframe. The lens stared down at the walkway like it didn't blink. The camera point idea was simple enough. You check in where the system can see you. You become a dot on someone's map. If the dot moves the way it's supposed to, the night stays boring. Keep it clean. Time, status, move on, she told me. That landed like a rule of its own. Time, status, move on. Not be safe. Not call if you need anything. The goal wasn't comfort. The goal was compliance. I looked down at my checklist and saw it laid out like a route through a maze. Each stop had a code, a location label, a space for a timestamp with a M and PM, a status box, and a small line for remarks. The remarks line was so short it discouraged thoughts. They wanted numbers and simple yes or no answers. They wanted the kind of log you could audit without ever meeting the person who wrote it. I started walking. The first corridor felt cooler than the staging room, and the air smelled faintly of cleaner and cold metal, like a freshly wiped handrail. My boots made a soft scuff-tap sound on the floor, loud only because there wasn't much else. That quiet wasn't peaceful. It was vacant. In the shop back home, even at night, you had life noises. A compressor cycling somewhere, a truck passing, a distant radio. Here, the building itself seemed to swallow sound. My own breathing felt like something I should keep under control. Stop one was an auxiliary power room. I scanned my badge, heard the click, and pulled the door open. The room greeted me with the first thing that mattered: sound. A steady fan. A low electrical hum. The subtle vibration you can feel in your teeth when you stand near active equipment. It was the normal room sound Wade had talked about without naming it. It's the difference between a space that's working and a space that's waiting for you to make a mistake. The smell was hot dust and old insulation with a hint of oil. It was familiar enough that my shoulders dropped without me noticing. I checked indicator lights, confirmed readings against the printed normal ranges, and took my time where it mattered. I listened too because people think maintenance is about turning wrenches, but half of it is hearing what doesn't belong. A bearing starting to go adds a rhythm to the hum. A relay sticking clicks too fast. A fan with a bent blade wobbles the air. Everything here sounded steady. I logged the time as 10:41 p.m., wrote normal in clean block letters, and moved on. Door closed, latch checked, no lingering. Stop 2 was a generator enclosure. The door handle was colder than I expected, metal holding onto the night like it didn't want to let go. Inside, the air was warmer and heavier. There was a faint fuel smell that always makes me think of long outages and bad weather. The generator wasn't screaming under load, but it was alive, low and constant, a bass note that lived in the room. I checked coolant level, scanned the floor for leaks, listened for any uneven knock. I watched a gauge needle for long enough to make sure it wasn't drifting. I logged 10:53 p.m. normal. I added p.m. like they wanted, every time, because if you don't, somebody will kick it back at you later and call it incomplete documentation. I didn't want any excuse for them to decide I wasn't worth the trouble. Stop 3 was HVAC, longer walk, 2 corners, a corridor that narrowed into a service lane with pipe runs overhead. The air moved in slow currents you could feel on the back of your neck. That's another thing people don't talk about. Buildings breathe. They exhale in certain spots. They pull in others. If you pay attention, you can tell when a fan bank is off just by how the air sits in your hair. I listened at the access panel before opening it, just because it's what I do. The fans were there, dull and constant. Filters were within schedule. Pressure readings matched the printed acceptable range. I took a quick look at belt condition and motor housing temperature with the back of my gloved hand, not because I expected a problem, but because I didn't want to get lazy on my first night. Logged 11:07 p.m. normal. Move on. That was the rhythm. Walk, listen, check, write, close, move. It's the kind of work where your hands do the same motions until your brain starts to drift, and drifting is dangerous on nights because your brain tries to fill the quiet with thoughts you don't need. The route took me through a pump room next. The sound there was different, a steady churn that reminded me of a fish tank filter, constant and simple. The smell was damp rubber and a faint chemical tang like treated water. I checked for vibration, any sign of cavitation, leaks at fittings. Everything looked tight, logged 11:16 p.m. normal. Next was a utility closet with a panel that ran power to some support systems I wasn't even told the purpose of. It smelled like rubber seals and cleaning chemical, sharp enough to make my eyes water if I breathed too deep. The panel was warm but not hot. Connections looked clean. No burn marks, no discoloration, logged 11:24 p.m. normal. I kept checking in at the camera points when the checklist told me to. I didn't want Iris to have to ask where I was. I didn't want to sound like I was lost. I moved to the marked spot, waited half a second like the camera needed time to see me, and keyed my radio. "Control, camera point 2, I said. No extra talk, no jokes. Just the dot on the map moving like it was supposed to. After that, the route turned more repetitive. Smaller checks, more doors, more rooms that looked like someone designed them to be serviced, not lived in. Each space had its own language of smell and sound. One room smelled like hot plastic and dust, the way an old TV smells when it's been on too long. Another had a metallic tang like pennies, which told me there were batteries somewhere nearby. A corridor smelled faintly like ozone, and I filed it away because ozone is either normal in certain equipment areas or a warning sign, depending on where you are. I wrote each entry with care. It sounds simple, but logging is a kind of discipline. When you're tired, you start rounding. You start thinking, close enough. You start letting your handwriting drift into something sloppy that you promise yourself you'll clean up later. Later doesn't exist on night shift. You either keep it clean in the moment or you don't. And a clean log isn't just for the people who read it. It's for you. It's a way of proving you were there. You checked the thing. You did it at that time. In the shop, logs could be a joke because everyone knew they got filled out at the end of the week in a rush. Here, the way Iris talked made it clear they treated logs like something that could save or kill you. That idea was still abstract until the first small weirdness showed up. It was a checkbox, that's all. A single square on the printed checklist. Eerie. I stopped at a line item labeled for a support panel I remembered checking because the door hinge squeaked in a way that annoyed me. I remembered the smell too, stale insulation with a hint of grease. I remembered the label slightly crooked, as if someone had tried to straighten it and given up. I'd been there. I'd logged it, but the checkbox next to it was blank. I stared at it longer than I should have. My pen hovered. I flipped back a page. My handwriting was there. The time, the status, normal. I flipped forward again. The box was still blank, like my pen had refused to make contact. My first thought was that I'd missed it. Fatigue does that. Your eyes slide. Your brain tells your hand you ticked the box and your hand doesn't. It happens. So I ticked it. One clean mark. I initialed next to it small, the way I do when I correct something on a maintenance sheet so it doesn't look like I tried to hide it. That's another habit. If you've ever had to explain paperwork, you learn to make your corrections look honest. I moved on, but I could feel the little itch in the back of my skull. Not fear yet. Just the sense that something didn't add up and I didn't have time to solve it. The second weirdness was digital. They had me logging on paper and on a small tablet clipped behind the clipboard. Redundancy. Audit friendly. I typed in a timestamp, 11:38 p.m., entered the room code and status, and hit confirm. The screen accepted it, but the spacing shifted a fraction, like the text snapped into a different alignment. No error message, no beep. Just a subtle change that made my entry look slightly off compared to the ones above it. Most nights, in most jobs, that's nothing. Software hiccups, glitch, move on. But on a first night in a place like this, even tiny things feel like a test. My fingers went still for a moment, and I had to force them to keep moving. I looked around the room as if someone might be standing there watching me type. Nobody was there, just equipment and quiet. I rechecked my entry. It was correct. The system had it. I wrote the same thing on paper to make sure at least one record was mine in my own handwriting. Then I moved on. The third weirdness was time. I logged one room at 11:46 p.m. I knew it because I'd looked at the radio clock right before writing it. Then I walked to the next stop, which was maybe a 2-minute walk, checked a panel, and looked back at the clock to log the new time. The radio clock read 11:47 p.m. 1 minute. That didn't match what my body felt. It didn't match the number of steps I'd taken. It didn't match the way the air had shifted on my face as I walked. I looked at the wall clock mounted above the doorway. Same minute. I checked the tablet system time. Same minute. 3 sources agreeing on a minute that felt stolen. I stood there, pen pressed lightly to the paper, and tried to reason it out. Maybe the first time stamp was wrong. Maybe I misread the last digit. Maybe I walked faster than I thought. Maybe my brain was already doing that night shift thing where it compresses time, like someone squeezed an accordion. I wrote 11:47 p.m. because I wasn't about to argue with 3 clocks. But I didn't like it. It left a cold spot in my stomach that had nothing to do with the air. That was when I saw Hank Dorr again. He wasn't on my checklist. He wasn't scheduled to be there in any way I could see. He was just there at the edge of a service corridor, half in the light, half in the shadow, like he'd been waiting at that exact point for me to reach it. He held his clipboard low, not like he was reading it, but like he was ready to move. His face looked like he'd been living on coffee and short sleep for years, not sloppy, not broken, just permanently braced. His eyes flicked to my radio, then to the clipboard, then to my face, like he was checking whether I'd started asking myself the wrong questions. "You'll learn fast what not to fix," Hank Dorr muttered. The way he said it made my skin tighten, not because it was spooky, because it was practical, like advice you give somebody before they touch a live wire. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means do your route," he said flatly. That was it. No elaboration, no story. He stepped past me without making it a big deal. I caught a faint smell of machine oil and stale coffee on him as he passed, and then he was gone around the corner, swallowed by the corridor like the building knew where to put him. I stood there a second longer than I meant to, listening. The place sounded normal, air moving, a distant fan, the faint click of a relay somewhere behind a wall. My own breathing, controlled but a little faster than before. The quiet was still quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt selective, like it was letting certain sounds exist and swallowing the rest. I shook it off and kept walking, because routine is what makes you feel sane. I checked the next stop, logged it, moved on. I checked the next, logged it, moved on. I made myself notice the small things that prove you're present, the way the flashlight beam picked up dust motes in the air when I angled it toward a vent, the way my fingers went numb for a second when I pressed them to a cold door handle, the way the radio mic clicked softly when I keyed it, like a tiny mechanical throat clearing, the way my boots picked up fine grit and left faint scuffs that disappeared when the light hit them from a different angle. Every time I wrote a timestamp, I added PM every time. Even when it felt stupid, especially when it felt stupid. It anchored me. The checklists and logs kept stacking up, and the part of my brain that loves job done right started to feel almost proud. Like I could make this work. Like the fences and cameras and policy voice on the radio were just another layer, not a threat. That's the thing about the early part of a night like that. It tries to convince you you're fine. I finished one more room, wrote 12:06 a.m., and paused just long enough to feel the shift into the next hour. The building didn't change. The lights didn't flicker. Nothing jumped out. It stayed steady, steady enough that I could almost laugh at myself for counting minutes and worrying about spacing on a tablet screen. Then I glanced back at the checkbox I'd corrected earlier, just because my mind wouldn't leave it alone. The tick mark was still there. But the little initial next to it looked lighter than the rest of my handwriting, like the ink had thinned. Not erased, not gone, just not as certain as it had been when I wrote it. I told myself it was the lighting. I told myself the pen was drying out. I told myself I was tired. I tightened my grip on the clipboard and kept walking, because the job was still just a job, and the rules were still just paper, and I was still convincing myself that nothing in a building could care where I walked. Not yet. The next stop on my checklist was labeled like any other: a room code, a location tag, a line for time, a box for status. Nothing about it looked special on paper. That was almost the worst part. The checklist didn't warn you. It just asked you to do the next thing. The corridor leading to it narrowed and got colder. Not dramatically colder, but enough that the skin on my knuckles tightened inside my gloves. The air felt drier here, like it had been pulled through a filter and stripped clean. My flashlight beam made the painted walls look chalky. The overhead lights were steady, bright, too honest. I stopped outside the door and did what I'd been doing all night. I listened before I touched anything. It was a habit, and now a rule I could feel in my pocket. Nothing. At first, I thought I wasn't listening hard enough. I leaned in slightly, ear angled toward the seam of the door, like you do with a closed room when you're trying to catch the faintest fan noise. Still nothing. No hum. No low vibration. No relay click. No airflow whisper. Not even the subtle electrical presence you usually feel as much as hear when you're standing near active equipment. It wasn't quiet. It was dead. That difference matters. Quiet is still a sound. Dead is an absence that feels like pressure. My hand hovered over the handle. My instincts argued with each other. The part of me that wanted to be competent said, open it, confirm, log it, move on. The part of me that remembered Wade's flat voice and the way Jonah had stared at me like a door said, don't. I forced myself to do it the way they'd taught me. I didn't touch the handle. I didn't test it. I didn't lean in farther. I keyed my radio and my throat tightened like I was about to admit something embarrassing. Control, I'm at the door. It's dead quiet. I'm deferring it, I said. There was a half beat of silence on the channel, long enough for my brain to start inventing consequences. Then Iris came back, exactly the way she'd been all night, like my words were just another line item. Copy, log it and move, Iris Matsu said. No questions, no stand by, no send a photo, just copy, log it, move. I stared at the door for one more second because some part of me expected it to react. It didn't. It sat there under the bright light, perfectly normal, perfectly sealed, like it had never heard of sound. I wrote the time on my sheet, made sure it was stamped right, then wrote the phrase exactly the way the rules page demanded, deferred due to silence. I didn't add anything else. I didn't give a theory. I didn't try to sound smart. Then I backed away and returned to the approved route. I didn't hurry. I wanted to, but the rules didn't say run. They said move on. Running would mean panic. Panic gets you sloppy. Sloppy gets you off route. Off route gets you saying the phrase Wade had drilled into my head, and I didn't want to have to say it. The corridor behind me felt different on the way out. It was the same paint, same lights, same floor, but the air felt thicker, like there was less room in it for breathing. I kept my eyes forward and my steps measured, listening to my boots to make sure I wasn't drifting. My radio crackled once with static that sounded like sand. That's when I saw the item in the walkway. It was placed too neatly to be accidental, Not kicked into a corner, not half hidden under a shelf, dead center, right where a person walking the route would step. A work glove. For a second, my brain tried to fill in the simplest explanation. Maybe I dropped it earlier. Maybe Hank dropped it. Maybe some tech left it and forgot. That's what happens in real facilities. People are human. Things get left behind. But this glove wasn't dusty. It didn't look like it had been sitting there. It looked like it had been set down. My chest tightened, not with fear exactly, but with that irritated, practical urge to fix a small problem. Pick it up. Put it somewhere safe. Keep the walkway clear. That urge is hardwired into anyone who's ever worked maintenance. You see a tripping hazard, you remove it. You see a loose panel, you tighten it. You see something out of place, you put it back. Rule 4 said, don't. I stopped at a safe distance and looked at it without leaning in. The glove was the same brand as the ones in my kit. Same color. Same reflective strip. I couldn't tell if it was actually mine or just identical. That was part of the hook. It looked familiar enough to trigger responsibility. I pulled the small site phone camera they'd provided in the kit for documentation only, the kind that stored photos internally and didn't connect to anything. I photographed the glove where it lay, then took a second photo with the nearby wall label in frame for location reference. I wrote the spot on my remarks line and marked it on the route map the way the checklist showed. Then I left it. It felt wrong. It felt childish, like I was refusing to pick up my own mess out of stubbornness. My hand twitched once as if it had its own opinion. I clenched it around the clipboard until my knuckles hurt, and I walked past the glove without looking down again, because looking down again would have been a temptation. I took maybe 10 steps before the lights ahead changed. They didn't flicker like old bulbs. They started blinking in a steady rhythm. On, off, a count. My first reaction was the normal one. Electrical issue, ballast going, a circuit problem that needed attention. I'd seen that kind of blinking 100 times, and my mind instantly reached for tools and fixes. Then, Rule 3 rose up like a hand in front of my face. If the hallway lights blink in a steady count, stop. Look down at the floor. Don't look down the hall until the counting stops. I stopped so hard my boot squeaked. The sound felt too loud. I angled my head down and fixed my eyes on the floor in front of my toes. The concrete had scuff marks and faint stains that looked like someone had dragged a cart with bad wheels over it 1,000 times. There was a small pebble near the baseboard. There was a thin line of dust in the corner. Normal things. I forced my brain to name them to stay anchored. The lights kept counting. On, off, on, off. My heart tried to count with it, and that made it worse. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my body reacting to the idea that something was approaching, even though the only thing changing was light. I kept my gaze down. That was the hardest part. The urge to look is almost painful. Whatever you don't see becomes the biggest thing in the world, and your brain convinces you that seeing it would make it smaller. Seeing it would make it manageable. I didn't look. A shadow moved across the floor. Not the normal sweep of my own shadow under blinking lights. This was a different shape, a movement that didn't match any body I could account for. It crossed just at the edge of my vision, fast enough that my brain couldn't grab it and turn it into an object. It was like someone walked past a doorway in the next room, only there was no doorway. Just open hall. My mouth went dry. I swallowed and tasted dust. On, off, on, off. I held still. I kept my eyes down. I counted my breaths in my head because it was the only counting I trusted. 1 in, 1 out. Slow, controlled. Don't drift. Don't step. Don't turn. The blinking stopped, not gradually. It stopped like a switch flipped. The overhead lights returned to steady brightness, and the corridor in front of me looked the same as it always had. Clean walls, straight line, nothing in the open space that explained the shadow on the floor. For a second, I didn't move. The rules didn't say how long to wait after the count. They just said, don't look until it stops. I gave it another beat anyway. Then I lifted my gaze carefully, like I was raising my head after a near miss. The corridor was empty. My body didn't believe it. My skin still felt tight, like I was bracing against impact. I took one slow step, then another, forcing my feet into the route like I was laying down tracks. My radio crackled. I thought it was Iris checking in again, but it wasn't her voice. "You see anything out of place, you leave it," Hank Dorr told me. I stopped walking. My hand went to the radio without thinking. Hank wasn't supposed to be on my channel. At least, I didn't think he was. I didn't know how he'd known what I'd just seen, but the way he said it made it clear he knew. "Even if it's mine?" I asked. There was a pause, and when he answered, his voice dropped lower, the way a man talks when he doesn't want the building itself to hear him. "Especially if it's yours," he said quietly. The channel went silent again, like he'd never been there. I stood in the middle of the corridor with my clipboard pressed against my chest, feeling the rules page behind it like a second heartbeat. My instincts wanted to turn around and check the glove again, just to prove I hadn't imagined it. My instincts wanted to go back to the silent door and open it just to end the uncertainty. My instincts wanted to do anything except keep walking like a compliant dot on a map. I didn't do any of it. I wrote my next timestamp with a shaking hand and made the letters clean anyway. I moved forward, one step at a time, staying on route, checking my corners the way the checklist taught me to, and refusing to look back. And the building let me. That was what scared me most, how quickly it returned to normal. No lingering flicker, no alarm, no footsteps, no sound chasing me. Just steady lights and steady air, like the corridor had swallowed whatever caused the count and gone still again. Like it had taken one careful bite and decided to wait for the next one. I tried to get back into the routine after that. That's what you do when something doesn't fit. You don't stare at it until it grows teeth. You put your head down and do the next task in front of you. I hit 2 more stops on the checklist, listened for normal room sound, checked readings, logged the time the way they wanted it, and moved on. I made myself focus on small, boring details like a belt tension that felt right under my thumb and the faint warmth of a motor housing that told me it was running steady. But the deferred door stayed in my mind like a splinter. Every time I keyed the radio for a camera point, I expected Iris to mention it. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see that glove again, still sitting in the walkway like a dare. I didn't. The route stayed clean. The hallways stayed bright. The building wore its normal face again, and that made my nerves worse, not better. When control called, it wasn't at a camera point. It wasn't a routine check-in. Iris's voice cut in without warning, and the fact that she used a different tone for once made my stomach drop. "Supervisor wants that check completed," Iris Matsu said. I stopped walking. My flashlight beam steadied on the floor, a pale oval of light that didn't shake even though my hand wanted to. I didn't ask which check. I already knew. In this place, the rules didn't exist on paper alone. They existed in the gaps between what you were told to do and what you were told not to do. I glanced down at my clipboard. The deferred line sat there like a bruise. Deferred due to silence. Incomplete. A gap. I didn't want gaps either. Gaps are what get people audited. Gaps are what get you called into an office. Gaps are what got my old shop shut down, even if it deserved it. In my head, I could already hear the language they'd use for it. Non-compliant, unresolved, incomplete documentation. I keyed the radio, and my throat tightened again. I tried to keep my voice even, like I was reporting a normal mechanical issue. "It's still quiet," I said. I was expecting Iris to say copy, log it again, move on. I was expecting her to tell me it could wait until day shift. I was expecting someone, anyone, to acknowledge that the rules page existed. Instead, the channel stayed silent for a beat too long. Then, I heard a voice that wasn't Iris. "Open it and confirm," a voice said. It sounded like Wade Corbin. Same flat confidence, same clipped delivery. The kind of voice you trust because it never sounds uncertain. The kind of voice that tells you something is policy, not opinion. I felt my skin go tight. My first instinct was relief. Of course. Wade wants it done. Wade knows the site. Wade wouldn't tell me to do something that would get me killed. Then the second instinct hit, slower, colder. Wade wasn't on my channel. Wade had told me the rules weren't suggestions. Wade had told me to use exact phrases, nothing else. Wade didn't strike me as the type to break his own rules. I tried to keep the question casual, like I was just verifying a radio glitch. "That you, Wade?" I asked. The reply came instantly, too clean, like it had been waiting for me to ask the right thing. "Just do the job," the voice repeated. My heart beat hard once, then settled into a fast rhythm that felt mechanical. I stared down the corridor toward the deferred door, and the lights above me looked a little whiter than before, like someone had turned the brightness up. I didn't move right away. I stood there doing the math in my head. Option 1. I refuse. I keep the deferred log. I get flagged. I lose the job. I go back to my empty fridge and late rent and a phone full of reminders. I go home and tell my parents I couldn't hold it together for a month. Option 2, I do what I'm told. I open the door. I confirm. I keep the log clean. I keep the job. My mind tried to make it simple. That's what it does when it doesn't want to admit fear. It reached for trade logic because trade logic is safe. Maybe the equipment was in standby mode. Maybe this particular room was sound isolated by design. Some sites build quiet rooms. You don't want vibration. You don't want acoustic bleed. Maybe I'd overreacted because I was new and the rules page had gotten in my head. Maybe dead quiet wasn't a warning at all. Maybe it was normal for this door. And even if it wasn't, I could make a compromise. I could break the rule in the smallest possible way. I could crack it, keep my body outside, listen for sound, confirm from the threshold, and close it. Just enough to satisfy compliance, not enough to get pulled inside. That was how I justified it. That was the lie that let my feet start moving. I walked back along the route with my eyes fixed forward. I didn't take shortcuts. I didn't drift. I told myself that meant I was still obeying the spirit of the rules, even if I wasn't. The corridor looked normal. Same paint, same clean corners, same lack of human mess. The only thing that felt different was the air. It felt flatter, like the building had turned down the oxygen by 1%. Not enough to notice if you weren't paying attention, enough to make your lungs work a little harder. When I reached the door, I stopped at the exact same spot I'd stopped before. The handle looked the same. The seam looked the same. The badge reader blinked green like it was eager. I didn't like that. I didn't like that it was green. I scanned my badge anyway. The reader chirped, the lock clicked, policy, permission, normal. I leaned in and listened again. Still nothing. No fan, no hum, no relay, no airflow. The room beyond the door might as well have been a sealed vacuum. My hand hovered over the handle. I could feel sweat building inside my glove, making the fabric cling to my palm. The rule page behind my checklist felt heavier than paper. I could hear Wade's voice in my head saying, "These aren't suggestions." I could hear Iris saying, "Keep it clean." I could hear Hank's quiet warning about leaving things that looked like they belong to you. And I could hear the other voice, the one that sounded like Wade but wasn't supposed to be there, saying, "Do the job." I told myself I wasn't going in. I told myself I was just confirming. I turned the handle and pulled the door open maybe 2 inches. That was it. Just a crack. The air changed immediately. Not a breeze, not a draft. A pressure shift, like my ears needed to pop but couldn't. The hairs on my forearms lifted under my sleeves. My stomach clenched hard, the way it does when an elevator drops half a floor. The darkness inside the room wasn't normal darkness. It wasn't a lack of light. It was a thickness, like the light from the hallway couldn't push into it. My flashlight beam hit the gap and came back dull, swallowed. I froze with my hand still on the handle. From inside, I didn't hear sound. I didn't hear anything at all. But I felt something like attention, not eyes on me. More like the room itself, registering that a boundary had been broken. The overhead lights in the hallway didn't start blinking yet. They didn't count. They did something worse. They shifted rhythm. I can't explain it like a mechanic's report because it wasn't a mechanical failure. The light stayed on, but the brightness pulsed subtly in a pattern that made the space feel like it was breathing. In, out, a slow, steady wave that didn't match any electrical issue I'd ever seen. My throat tightened. I forced myself to do the confirm part because that was the bargain I'd made with myself. I angled my head slightly, tried to look past the crack without opening it farther. The room refused to show me anything. The darkness sat there and held its shape. My hand started to shake. Not from fear, I told myself, from tension. From holding the door against some pressure I couldn't name. My grip slipped once, and the door pulled a fraction wider on its own, like the latch wanted to open. That was when my body finally did something smart. I shoved the door closed. The latch clicked. The green light on the reader blinked once and went steady again. The hallway brightness returned to normal, as if the building had inhaled and exhaled and decided to keep going. I stood there breathing too hard, my heart hammering in my ribs. My radio crackled with static that sounded like sand in a speaker. I didn't key it. I didn't speak. I just listened to my own pulse and tried to convince myself I'd fixed it. But closing the door didn't feel like undoing anything. It felt like finishing a sentence that shouldn't have been started. I turned to head back to the route, and that's when I noticed the distance. The camera point I'd checked in at earlier should have been maybe a 30-second walk away. A straight corridor, one corner, a clear sight line. I could picture it in my head because I'd walked it twice already. I started walking toward it, and the corridor didn't behave like a corridor. My steps were steady. The walls didn't change. The lights stayed the same. But the camera point didn't get any closer. The corner ahead stayed the same distance away, like the hallway had stretched just enough to keep me moving without arriving. I stopped and looked down at the floor, checking my own position like I'd somehow drifted off the center line. My boots were on the same scuffed marks I remembered. My shadow fell the same way under the lights. Everything looked right. Everything felt wrong. I forced myself to keep walking because stopping in the middle of a corridor at night in a restricted site is how you get questions you can't answer. I kept my eyes forward. I kept my breathing controlled. I kept the clipboard tight against my chest like it could protect me. By the time I reached the corner, my legs felt heavy, like I'd been walking longer than I should have. I turned it, and the camera point sign was finally there, exactly where it was supposed to be. I exhaled hard through my nose, almost angry at myself for thinking the building could change distance. I wanted to laugh it off. I wanted to call it adrenaline. I wanted to blame it on the cold and the sterile lighting and the fact that I'd slept like garbage for weeks. But when I checked the radio clock to log my next timestamp, the minute had barely moved. It was like the hallway had stolen time and given me nothing back. I wrote the time anyway. I added AM and PM. I kept my handwriting clean even though my fingers trembled. I didn't mention the stretch. I didn't mention the pressure. I didn't mention the darkness that swallowed my flashlight beam. I told myself I'd made a mistake and corrected it by closing the door. And the part of me that had listened to the silence the first time knew better. Because something had heard the latch click. Something had felt the crack open. And now it knew I was willing to break a rule if the right voice told me to. The building didn't punish me right away. That was the part that almost let me believe I'd gotten away with it. I kept moving, because moving was the only thing I still understood. I hit the next stop, listened for room sound, logged the status, and walked out. I did it again. I kept my route clean the way Iris wanted. I didn't take shortcuts, I didn't drift, I didn't touch anything that wasn't on my checklist. I told myself that if I just acted normal long enough, the night would settle back into routine, and the door I'd cracked would become a bad decision I didn't repeat. Then, the lights ahead of me started counting again. This time, it wasn't subtle. It wasn't a soft on-off that you could misread as a ballast issue. It was sharper, tighter, more deliberate, like someone had turned the hallway into a metronome and dared me to keep time with it. On, off, on, off. It felt closer to me than the last time, like the count was happening in the air right in front of my face. The rhythm was faster too, a quick, steady beat that made my pulse stumble as it tried to match it. Rule 3 hit my brain like a command. Stop. Look down. Don't look ahead until it stops. I stopped. I angled my head down and stared at the floor the way I'd done before, forcing my eyes to lock onto scuff marks, tiny chips in the concrete, the faint shadow of my boots under the blinking light. I could feel my hands tightening around the clipboard without meaning to. My jaw clenched hard enough that my teeth ached. On, off. The air felt thick again, like pressure building in a sealed space. My ears buzzed faintly, not a sound from equipment, more like my own body reacting to something it couldn't name. I kept my gaze down and tried to slow my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, controlled. Then something tugged the clipboard, not a gentle pull like I'd caught it on my jacket. A sharp yank that slid it backward against my chest, as if someone had grabbed the bottom edge and tried to rip it out of my hands. The motion was so sudden, it stole my balance for half a step. My instincts screamed at me to look up. I didn't. I tightened my grip and held it close, fingers digging into the hard plastic clip until my knuckles burned. The counting didn't stop. It didn't even change pace. It kept blinking like nothing had happened, like the yank was part of the rhythm. On, off, on, off. My radio crackled once at my hip, and the sound was wrong. Not static, not interference. It was a thin, dry scraping noise, like sand being poured onto a hot plate. My flashlight in my pocket cut out for a split second on the off beat, then came back on the on beat, like it was obeying the count too. That was when the door behind me slammed. No wind, no footsteps, just a hard metal bang that vibrated through the corridor and up into my bones. The noise echoed once, then got swallowed, the building eating it like it hadn't happened. I flinched, and my eyes almost lifted. I caught myself in time and forced my gaze lower, as if staring harder at the floor would hold me in place. On, off, on, off. A shadow crossed the floor again, but this time it moved slower. It didn't dart past the edge of my vision. It glided, steady and intentional, like something pacing. The shape wasn't human, not in a way my brain could settle on, but it had weight. It blocked light in a way that made the floor look deeper where it passed. My throat tightened so hard, it felt like swallowing glass. I didn't speak. I didn't key the radio. I didn't do anything except stay still and keep my eyes down, because the only reason I was still alive in that hallway was because I was following a rule that had been written by someone who wanted to stay alive too. The blinking stopped. The overhead lights returned to steady brightness so abruptly it made my eyes sting. For a second, the corridor looked washed out, like the world had been overexposed. I kept my head down one extra beat, then lifted my gaze carefully. The hallway was empty. No person, no shape, no movement, just clean walls and bright light and my own breath too loud in my ears. But my clipboard felt warm where it had been tugged, like friction heat from a hand that wasn't there. I didn't wait for it to happen again. I started walking, and this time I wasn't thinking about finishing the checklist. I was thinking about the camera point. The rules weren't about safety in the way normal rules are. They weren't about locking doors or keeping outsiders out. They were about pattern, route, being where the building expected you to be, staying inside the places where you were visible to the system that mattered. The camera point was the only thing that felt like ground. I moved fast without running, because running would mean panic, and panic would mean mistakes. My steps were tight and controlled. I kept my shoulders squared and my eyes forward, forcing myself to look like a man doing his job instead of a man trying not to fall apart. My hands shook anyway. My mouth tasted like metal. The corridor tried to stretch again. I felt it in my legs before I saw it. The corner stayed far for too long. The sign that should have approached didn't. It was like walking on a treadmill where the scenery refuses to change. I focused on the floor and the walls and kept moving. I didn't give the hallway the satisfaction of making me stop. When I finally reached the camera point, the little sign was there, exactly where it belonged, and the camera above it stared down with its unblinking lens. I stepped into position as if I'd been told to stand there at gunpoint. I raised the radio and keyed it with a thumb that didn't feel like mine. Control. I need a check-in right now. My voice came out thin. No response, not even a copy, not even a click. I tried again without speaking, just keying the mic to see if the channel was alive. The radio gave me that dry scrape again, sand on metal, then went quiet. The silence after it felt heavy, like the building had stuffed cotton into my ears. I stood under the camera with my heart hammering and my skin crawling, and it hit me with a cold clarity that was worse than fear. Control wasn't helping because control wasn't for helping. It was for tracking. It was for records. It was for compliance. A presence moved at the edge of my vision, not in the corridor, but beside me, close enough that the air changed. I turned my head slowly, because the blinking had stopped and the rules didn't tell me not to look anymore. A woman stood there like she'd stepped out of a different world. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't carrying a tool bag. She had a clipboard, but it looked too clean, too new, like it hadn't been dragged through hallways. Her coat was neat. Her posture was straight. Her expression was calm in a way that didn't belong on a night shift. She looked at me like I was a file she'd already read. You weren't hired to fix machines. You were hired to keep the root intact, Marion Voss said flatly. The words hit like a diagnosis, like the truth of my job had been printed somewhere, and I'd been the last one to see it. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. My brain tried to grab onto the practical parts of what she said, like it could repair the meaning the way you repair a broken switch. Root intact. Keep it intact. I thought about the checkboxes, the exact phrases, the camera points, the way the building had stretched the hallway when I tried to leave the wrong way, the way the lights had counted like a signal. Marion's gaze didn't flicker. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what happened at the door. She didn't even look down the corridor to see if anything was there. She only watched me, like she was waiting for my body to accept what my mind was fighting. "Congratulations, Spencer. You're compliant now," she told me. And just like that, the air pressure eased. The buzzing in my ears faded. The corridor behind her looked normal again. The light stayed steady. My flashlight stayed on. My radio sat silent and harmless at my hip. It was like someone flipped a switch labeled compliant and the building relaxed. I stood under the camera point, breathing hard, realizing something that made my stomach drop deeper than any shadow on the floor. The night wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to shape me. It had tested my instincts, then tested my obedience, then tested whether I could be pushed into breaking a rule on command. And now, with Marion Voss standing beside me like a stamp of approval, it felt like the facility had decided I belonged to the process. The corridor stayed empty. The door that had slammed stayed closed. The lights didn't count again. Everything went quiet, steady, and clean, like the building had taken what it wanted and gone still. I finished the remaining stops on the checklist because my body knew how to do it even when my mind didn't. Walk, listen, check, log. Time, status, move on. My hands wrote numbers that looked clean on paper, but they didn't feel like my handwriting anymore. They felt borrowed. Every room I entered had the normal sound again. Fans, relays, hum. Like the silence had been a mistake that got corrected. Like the counted blinking had been a momentary glitch. Nobody mentioned it. Not Iris, not Hank, not Marion Voss again. The radio stayed quiet unless I called in at a camera point, and even then the responses were minimal, clipped, and steady. It was worse than being yelled at. It was worse than being threatened. It was like the night had never happened, and I was the only one who had felt it. That made me question myself in a way I hated. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe the pressure shift was in my head. Maybe the hallway only felt longer because my heart was racing. That line of thinking is a trap, and I knew it, because I'd seen it in my old shop. When something goes wrong, the easiest way to survive is to act like it didn't. You keep your head down. You make the paperwork look clean. You tell yourself you're being practical. By the time I returned to facility staging, the air felt warmer. Or maybe I was just numb enough not to notice the cold. Wade Corbin was there like he'd been there all night, like he hadn't moved. Same posture, same plain expression, same tired eyes that didn't ask questions. He held out a hand without looking at my face. "Turn in your kit," Wade Corbin said. I unhooked the radio and set it down. I placed the flashlight beside it. The keys clinked once on the metal table. I slid the clipboard forward, careful not to let the rules page slip out from behind it like it was contraband. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt thick. I had to force the words out. "Am I fired?" I asked. Wade didn't hesitate. He didn't soften it. He didn't say no or we'll see or get some sleep. He used a word that sounded like a form. "You're processed," he said flatly. Processed, like a package, like a file, like something that went through a system and came out labeled. I walked out of there, and physically I got out. Back to quarters, back to a bed that didn't feel like mine, back to a space where I could close a door and pretend I had privacy. I showered until my skin went hot, and I still felt cold underneath. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, waiting for my heart to slow down, waiting for the counted blinking to start behind my eyelids. When sleep finally took me, it was shallow and thin. In the morning, my sealed pouch with my phone was waiting where it was supposed to be, like the world still cared about procedure. I turned it on and saw an email from the contractor. The subject line was neutral, the kind of neutral that makes your stomach drop before you open it. It wasn't a termination notice the way normal jobs do it. It read more like a status update. Administrative language, effective immediately. A change in role classification, no explanation, no appeal. There was an attachment called Night Runner Rules, Revision. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. Same 5 rules, same short lines, same exact phrases Wade drilled into me. Then I saw the approval line at the top. It wasn't Wade's name. It wasn't Kara's. It was mine. Approved by S. Rains. I just stared at it, waiting for my brain to explain it away, waiting for it to feel like a typo. It didn't. Because deep down, I understood what processed meant. I hadn't been fired. I hadn't vanished. I hadn't died in a hallway with counted lights. I'd been absorbed into the system that wrote the rules. And somewhere down the line, someone like me would open a clipboard, feel that extra weight of paper, and believe those rules were just policy. Until the building decided to teach him the same lesson.